So welcome to everyone joining online and here in person. We have the pleasure today from the Ghent Center of Digital Humanities to welcome Julia to give a talk about her computational literary studies infrastructure fellowship here at Ghent, which she's been doing for the last 6 weeks. And it's been such a pleasure to have her here at this group and also have her at the training school last week for CLS. We did lots of networking, lots of learning from each other that I know will continue into the next period, which is really important for the fellowships because the CLS intro fellowships, which the deadline or the new call is open now as well for anyone listening that's interested in becoming a fellow. It's the final call of the project. Which gives you an opportunity to go to the different universities and work with partners and learn new skills and work on really specific projects. So that was my promotion about that. And without further ado, I will give the word to Julia, who will tell us about catching feelings.
Thank you, Julie. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. For those who don't know you and are just coming to hear about the project, my name is Julia. I'll be telling you a little bit about the Catching Feelings project, which I've been working on for the past 6 weeks, as Julie said. I'll be talking for maybe half an hour, 35 minutes, and then we will have time for questions both online and in the room. So this is what we'll be talking about. First, I will introduce my research, my PhD research, and how this fellowship sort of fit into that. Then I'll talk to you about the Catching Feelings project itself, what we did, what we're still planning to do, and then finally, I want to talk a little bit about all the fun stuff I also did during the fellowship period, because as Julie said, it's also about networking, and it's also, of course, important to have fun. So my PhD is part of a larger project that is called Anchoring Innovation, and the project examines the different ways that innovation can be embedded in existing cultures, mostly looking at antiquity. And so there's these two different concepts here. The idea that in order to do something new or to create a new cultural phenomenon, it needs to be anchored in something that is already familiar to people. So anchoring and innovation. And then in my dissertation, I'm examining how these processes of anchoring innovation take shape in a slightly different domain, which is fan fiction about Greek mythology. So the question is, how do fans of Greek mythology adapt and transform elements from that existing cultural canon in their contemporary rewritings? And I'm focusing on a specific website for that, which is the Archive of Our Own. And we'll talk about Archive of Our Own in a bit, and I'll also talk to you about what fanfiction actually is. But I first want to explain how the fellowship I did fits into that larger project. And that is really a sort of second layer, which is not about the fanfiction itself, but about the reception of the fanfiction. So we're talking essentially about a reception of a reception, because fanfiction, of course, is already a response from audiences to particular source materials. And then that fanfiction itself is also received by readers. And they also have a lot of comments on these stories. So that's what I looked at in the Catching Feelings project. And the idea behind this is essentially that with fan fiction, because it's exchanged online and it's written in sort of very deeply entwined communities of readers and writers, it doesn't really make sense to take a traditional literary studies approach and say, what do these stories do? What do they represent? How do they work? If you don't also pay attention to how their audiences respond to them, how the interaction between readers and writers takes shape. So that's why I decided to examine the comments on this fan fiction. And then the more specific question was, which aspects of these stories are particularly appreciated or critiqued in the comments that readers leave on them? Okay, so this is just a little introduction for those of you who are not very familiar with fan fiction yet. This is what it looks like when you go to Archive of Our Own, which is one of the biggest fan fiction archives on the web right now, especially I would say for English language fan fiction, and you select a specific story. So you can see that the title of this story is Pomegranate. The author's username is Silverpard, and there's a summary there that readers can use to select the story. So it explains that this is a retelling of both Greek mythology and the Sherlock Holmes stories, because it's a story where Sherlock as Hades and John Watson is Persephone. So it's an interesting sort of intertwining of different cultural materials. And you can also see up top that the author has attached a bunch of metadata explaining what kind of story this is, the characters that it's about, the relationship that it's going to explore. So those are all things that readers can use to navigate this huge resource of like millions of stories to find whatever they're looking for. So this is like the top of the page. And then at the bottom of the page, there's also a comment section. And in this comment section, for each chapter, readers can leave their responses. And I've anonymized their usernames, but you can see sort of how that goes. They leave a comment on a chapter, and they say something like, "This was so sweet. This was heartwarming. Thank you for writing this," heart emoji. All sorts of evaluations. They're overwhelmingly positive, and they relate to different aspects of the story. So that's what I was interested in exploring in this fellowship. And so I collected a data set of about 25,000 comments. It's almost 100,000 words. So then there's a slight moment of panic. What am I going to do with this data? Reading it all is probably not going to be the best approach. And that's more or less where the fellowship comes in, because I had some fantastic help from the people here in Ghent to approach this in a more computational manner. So the method that we applied is called aspect-based sentiment analysis. So it's about analyzing the different aspects that are mentioned in these comments, and then also analyzing the sentiments or evaluations that are attached to these aspects. And so far, we've gone through 3 different steps. Oh, this is not in the right order. The first step was conceptualization. So it was essentially me deciding what aspects do I want to map? What am I interested in? There's a lot of different stuff being mentioned in this data. Some of it is super random. What are we focusing on? And then the second step was annotation. So sort of manually selecting these aspects and the associated sentiments so that we could have some training data for the aspect-based sentiment analysis step. And I'll walk you through them a little bit more in detail right now. So these are the aspects that I came up with. And there's quite a few. There's 7 really, and I'll just walk you through them. So the first, the canon aspect, is about the different elements from the canonical material, so from Greek mythology, that are being evaluated. So something like, if somebody says this is a great retelling of the Iliad, I really love how this responded to existing myths. I really love how this changed an existing myth, then that would be a canon aspect. Character aspects, I think, more or less speak for themselves. They're mentions of the fictional characters in the story. Then I was really interested in the emotions of characters. So if somebody says it's really great to see Odysseus be happy, or it's really nice to see a story where everybody is very sad, this actually happens a lot, then that's a character emotion, right? I was also interested in events, but then I very quickly discovered that it's very difficult to separate events out from all the other stuff that is being mentioned. So for example, if a commenter writes, "I love the part where they went into the underworld," it's difficult for me to say, is it the going there that is the aspect, or is it the underworld as a location that is sort of the draw? So I grouped these two together. So we have events and story worlds more or less as one aspect, and that's also led to some problems, but I'll get to those in a bit. I added a general category because there's a lot of just general, I love this, great story, this chapter was amazing, etc. Then I added a category for reading experience. So for the aspects that how people describe their experience of reading the story. And finally, style. Also, I would say more or less straightforward. And style is just like any aspect of how the story is textually rendered or written down. So I had these aspects more or less just based on reading a bunch of comments and thinking about what I was interested in. I also did a little bit of topic modeling on the comments to see like what aspects are often mentioned. And one of the sort of key things I want to mention here is that there's also a lot of moments in these comments where people try to forge a relationship with the writer. So there's a lot of times in fanfiction comments where people say, please write more, I love your work, you are amazing, can I have your email, etc., etc. And I decided not to look at those. And the reason for that is mostly that I'm just interested in what's happening in the stories and not so much in the social dynamics between the people in the community. But that distinction is also sometimes a little murky. So that's something for you to keep in mind. Then we had to do annotation, which is a lot of work. And the annotation looks more or less like this. So in the comment texts, I would select a location where a certain aspect is mentioned. So the first thing you see here is Psyche and Ariadne, and then also attach an evaluation to it. And so an aspect could be any of the 7 things I just mentioned, and then the evaluation could be either positive or negative. And like I was already expecting, about 95% of all the evaluations we annotated were actually positive ones. So this is what this looks like. It just, yeah, it's a lot of work. I just did all of that. And then the amazing Amanda helped me by annotating an overlapping 100 comments. And the value of this is that if you have 2 people annotating the same text, then you can sort of tell whether the annotations were consistently done and whether your intuitive idea of the concepts you're annotating sort of makes intuitive sense to another person as well. So it's a kind of sanity check. And then one way of evaluating the sanity check is to calculate inter-annotator agreement. So we did that as well. We calculated Cohen's kappa, and we got really, really, really high scores for that, which I'm really happy with. And that might also be because Amanda and I both have a lot of knowledge about the fanfiction community and have sort of background reading a lot of fanfiction. So a lot of the time with these different concepts, we would agree. But so this is really good. This means that our annotations were more or less consistent, which is great because we need them to train an aspect-based sentiment analysis model. So this is a little bit of an overview of how that works. First, you have the data, in this case, all of the different comment texts, and then you do the aspect-based sentiment analysis essentially in 2 steps. And the first step is identifying the aspect, and then the second step is identifying the sentiments and attaching them to the aspects. And there's 3 different ways of doing the aspect extraction. We decided not to go with a rule-based approach because that basically entails just formulating a bunch of rules and saying, whenever somebody writes great, it's positive evaluation. Whenever somebody writes Achilles, that's a character. And then putting all of those rules into the computer and you can get sentiment analysis scores. The reason we decided not to go with this is that it's very time consuming and the rules that you end up with are then very domain specific. So not very useful, for example, to generalize to other fan communities either. So not doing that. Instead, we're doing a machine learning approach. So we're putting the annotations into a pipeline that will identify the aspects and the associated sentiments. We're also still thinking about taking a generative approach. But the thing, of course, is that you have a risk that a large language model might hallucinate some results for you. And also, I think it's a little bit tricky because large language models are often trained on internet data, and fan fiction is actually quite a big chunk of internet data. So there might be a little bit of an effect there in the way that a large language model responds to fan fiction data that we don't fully understand. So that's a little bit more difficult. And then we felt machine learning gives the sort of optimal overlap of having a little bit of control, but also not having to do everything manually. So that's what we're going with. And then I have some very, very preliminary findings for you because we're still trying to figure out what the best approach to this actually is. But the pipeline we've worked with so far succeeded pretty decently at identifying characters, general aspects, and style. It really struggled with the character emotions, which is not very surprising because I think emotions ascribed to a character and emotions described as a part of the reading experience can sort of take the same shapes. They use the same words to describe them, only those emotions are then attributed to different agents. So that's really tricky. And the other thing, like I said at the beginning, the detection of events was also very tricky. And I know that event detection in literary studies is also a notoriously tricky problem because the boundaries of an event are very difficult to detect. And we found the same thing essentially here as well. We did also find that sentiment in all of these comments was overwhelmingly positive. So that sort of confirms what we were already thinking at the start. Yeah, and then the event and character emotion aspects were difficult to detect and showed confusion with the other aspects. I also have to say that the events were the only aspect where during the annotation phase we already had a little bit of confusion, so that probably doesn't help the model figure this out. And then while annotating, I did notice that this community building function of the comments, so the saying thank you, the asking for more stories, the saying I will write you a story in response to this story, that's actually a pretty big chunk of the data as well. So I do think it's important to keep in mind that we're leaving that out for now. And the other thing, of course, is that we're leaving out all of the people who read a lot of fan fiction and never write a comment on it. So this is a little bit of a biased data set in that sense. Because research has shown, for example, that only about half of the people who read fan fiction on the Archive of Our Own also sometimes leave a comment. So there's a bunch of reading experiences that we're just not getting at with this method. And right now we're still working on finding the optimal machine learning approach to this problem. We're also writing a paper about it, so please stay tuned for more. And then finally, I just want to give you a quick overview of all the fun things I've done during the fellowship. So now comes the fun part. I talked to so many interesting people. I want to thank everybody who's in the room for being super fun and nice to work with and interesting to talk to. And it was really a great experience. I attended Digital Humanities Benelux in Leuven, which is always a wonderful conference with wonderful people. Then I attended the training school in Vienna, which was also really lovely. And Vienna was really beautiful. And I had a great time. And then finally, I also attended the Conference of Computational Literary Studies, which is really a very exciting conference. And I was also very happy to be there. So like I said, I want to thank everyone who contributed to making this possible. I want to thank the people of Anchoring Innovation for letting me go for a couple of weeks. I want to thank the CLS Infra Project for funding this fellowship. I want to thank my home university for making this possible, and I want to thank all of the fascinating people who write and read fan fiction on Archive of Our Own, because without them, I wouldn't have anything to research. Any questions? Thank you.